welcome back. So yesterday we had a great conversation and some great speakers talking to us about civil discourse and speaking truth to power. So really yesterday we got a touch of both theory and practice. Today we're going to turn to both of those topics, civil discourse and speaking truth to power, in the context of two very influential institutions in our country. Higher education, which most of us in this room are all part of, and the media. And we're going to explore civil discourse and speaking truth to power. Now, each of you got a copy of the Constitution of the United States on purpose. A good segue from the judge's speech last night was that document is pretty fundamental to understanding a lot of notions connected to speaking truth to power. So I commend to you sometime, take just a few minutes to read. I think that's a 39-page small document worth knowing and understanding what's in there, which will help us as we frame out some of the issues that you're going to hear today. So our next speaker was in the news last year when she was caught up in a student protest at her university against a controversial conservative speaker. That protest went a little bit awry. Here to share her first-person experience with the state of free speech on a college campus and some insights on how to proceed forward is Dr. Allison Stanger. Dr. Stanger is the Russell Lang 60 Professor of International Politics and Economics and the founding director of the Rowatton Center for International Affairs at Middlebury College in Vermont. Dr. Stanger earned her PhD in political science at Harvard University. She is the author of One Nation Under Contract, The Outsourcing of American Power and the Future of Foreign Policy, and her forthcoming Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Leaks, the story of whistleblowing in America, will be published soon by Yale University Press. She is working on a new book also, tentatively titled Consumers vs. Citizens, How the Internet Revolution is Remaking Global Security and Democracy's Public Square. Dr. Stanger has published opinion pieces in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Financial Times, International Herald Tribune, New York Times, USA Today, U.S. News and World Report, and the Washington Post. She has testified before the Commission on Wartime Contracting, the Senate Budget Committee, and the Congressional Oversight Panel. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and is a cybersecurity fellow at the New America Foundation. In March 2017, she wrote a New York Times opinion piece titled Understanding the Angry Mob at Middlebury That Gave Me a Concussion. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Allison Stanger.
Thank you. Got water here. Thank you. So I got to find a place to put my water. Can you hear me okay? All right, good. Maybe I'll just put it down here. Well, it's wonderful to see all of you here. Your uniforms are beautiful. I'm trying to understand the different types, and I can't tell you what a pleasure and an honor it is to be speaking at VMI. It's my first time to Lexington. I'm overwhelmed with how beautiful the surrounding area is and with how your campus is, so I hope you, when you walk out of here today, you appreciate the gift you've been given of a VMI education or a VMI conference. I should add that title of the New York Times piece, Understanding the Angry Mob at Middlebury That Gave Me a Concussion, was not my title. So just so you know, whenever you see a title that kind of makes you cringe a little bit, don't blame the author. The New York Times editorial board sets, they decide what the headline's going to be. So that wasn't my headline. You heard about some of the testimony I've given before Congress previously. I also just spoke on Thursday before the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee on freedom of speech on college campuses. And I'm happy to tell you here, because we're about to discuss something sad, I thought I'd begin with some good news, that at that hearing, a bipartisan consensus was reached on freedom of expression as the bedrock of liberal education and our constitutional democracy. That is a part of the congressional record now, and I do not think that is trivial to see Democrats and Republicans come together on this issue. So I'm delighted with that outcome and looking forward to the future with optimism. So that's the good news. Let me talk about the bad news, what happened to me last spring. I guess I should tell you the story since I can't assume you know it. Does that make sense to you? All right. I remember every detail, but I'm not expecting you to remember or know anything. So last March, the American Enterprise Institute Club at Middlebury College invited me to moderate an event with Charles Murray, the libertarian scholar from the American Enterprise Institute. And they asked me to do this. By moderating, they wanted me not just to decide who was going to ask questions, but also to talk about to give him a hard time, to give him 3 or 4 really tough questions at the beginning. That was the idea, and I prepared, I read everything, I prepared, I had great questions. There's a video you can see of it if you'd like, but it's not the video from the event in the lecture hall. What happened in the lecture hall is students stood up, they turned their backs, they shouted all these crazy slogans. It went on for 25 minutes, and we realized we could not continue with the event. Middlebury College had prepared for the contingency, so we went to a remote location in the same building to simulcast the event. We were determined that it would take place, despite the students that wanted to shut it down. And it went forward, but this enraged the protesters still further. So they started setting off fire alarms. They were hurling rocks at the windows. They were screaming obscenities through the windows. So if you watch that videotape, just keep in mind they're using directional microphones, so you really can't even hear how terrifying it was. But we did finish that event, and because we went forward, I think that enraged the protesters still further, so when we left the building, that's when we were attacked. They were really focused on Charles Murray. He's a 74-year-old man. He was 74 years old at the time, and it looked like he was going to fall, so I did what any of you would have done. I'm convinced you would have done the same thing. I grabbed his arm, both to keep him from falling, but also to be sure that we didn't get separated as we went to the car. So we got to the car, and somebody in that fracas, when they saw me take his arm, got so angry because I was, with my body, I was sort of preventing them from harassing him. Think about it, if you take someone's arm, your body's in the way. You're cutting off the angle for someone who's trying to get at him. So that's when they turned on me and somebody pulled my hair really hard from one direction. Another person body slammed me in the other. So I wound up with whiplash and a concussion. That was exacerbated by the getaway car. We had to get into a car. It was like a scene from Homeland. If you've ever watched that show, people jumping on the car, rocking it back and forth. Someone pulled a stop sign, stuck it underneath the car to try to keep it from moving forward. We were very concerned that we did not hit students. So I was in the passenger side. Bill Berger, the college communications director, was in the driver's seat. Charles Murray was in the back. Poor Bill was getting directions from outside. Stop, start, go here, do this, from various public safety. I was giving my own directions. You're all military people. You know it's bad when there's two commanders-in-chief, right? The result was the car was stopping and starting, and I think that exacerbated my condition. So I was in physical therapy until mid-September. So that's what happened. Why did it happen? I think there are three reasons. First of all, the election of Donald Trump set the stage for overreaction and misinterpretation. Charles Murray was a lightning rod in that context that he might not otherwise have been. And I've said elsewhere that Middlebury College is like any other liberal arts college. It's sort of a bubble, cut off from the outside world. But Middlebury College is also in the state of Vermont, which is also a bubble. National Republican candidates don't even campaign there because they know it's a lost cause. It's the state that received the second lowest percentage of Trump voters in the Union, just by 0.2 points, beating out, Hawaii is the one that had the lowest percentage. And so within that context, it was easy to overreact and misinterpret what Charles Murray represented. Second reason it happened is that some Middlebury faculty members cheered on the protest and did not encourage their students to read Charles Murray or listen to him first before drawing their own conclusions about his work and his character. And I can't stress to you enough how important this is for understanding what happened. There's a website called the Southern Poverty, it's an organization called the Southern Poverty Law Center. It did great work in the civil rights movement. Some have criticized it today for getting lists of proponents of hate, and Charles Murray is on that list. He's listed there as a white nationalist. It's full of pull quotes, I would argue, that are taken out of context. But so what happened was students, encouraged by faculty, they would just look at that website, see how this man had been labeled, and that was all they needed to know. They didn't need to read anything or learn anything further. That was all they needed to know to realize this man should not be allowed to speak. Third reason this happened is that some students genuinely believed that shutting down speech was a means to social justice. And some Middlebury faculty shared that view, thereby encouraging radical action. Are any of you familiar with the book Hillbilly Elegy? Have you heard anything about that? Yeah, okay. I met J.D. Vance earlier this month, and he asked me a great question. He asked me whether what happened to me was a one-off thing related to a particular moment in time or an expression of something larger. And I thought that was a really good question, so I wanted to share with you my answer to him. I responded that it is both. The overreaction was very much rooted in the bubble within a bubble that is Middlebury College, but it was also a reaction to larger trends in this country that have long been in motion, having to do with growing inequalities in our country that correlate with unequal K through 12 educational opportunities. So what happens is that Middlebury successfully recruits a diverse class of the best and the brightest from around the country and also the world. But some students of color who arrive on our campus from urban areas are confronted for the first time with the challenges of living in one of the whitest states in the Union. They can't even get their hair cut in Middlebury, Vermont, or get it cut properly. And there's a lot of other examples of how it seems like a very foreign place. At Middlebury, they also encounter unfathomable privilege. Middlebury, I don't know what the tuition is now, but I think it's well over $60,000 a year. 60% of our students pay the full amount. Okay, so it might be a little, I think that's roughly what it averages out to be. So they're encountering unfathomable privilege, which often is accompanied by a sense of entitlement. So since our Constitution once counted slaves as 3/5 of a human being, when vast inequality seems to align with racial difference, it breeds legitimate resentment. Now, I'm not telling you this to excuse the shutting down of speech and the violence to which it led, but I'm telling you this to point out that the emotions that those protesters brought to the event were real and justified. There is still, in my view, much equality work to do in this country. So lest I be misunderstood, I want to make it clear that we're talking about a small minority of students and faculty who applauded censorship. But they were loud and vocal, just as those of us were who stood for freedom of expression. And I think we could say that a fundamental misunderstanding arose. Instead of seeing freedom of speech and expression as the bedrock of American constitutional democracy and of liberal education, the ground rules through which greater diversity and inclusivity have been and can still be achieved, the opponents of having Charles Murray speak on campus saw a trade-off between freedom of speech on the one hand and inclusivity on the other. So you have to choose. Do you want freedom of speech, or do you want to be inclusive? Make everybody, every American, feel at home at Middlebury College. Now, in my view, nothing could be further from the truth to suggest there's this trade-off between inclusivity and freedom of speech. Because freedom of speech is the foundation you need, if we look at the history of this country, for greater inclusivity and diversity. If you look at the history of the country, you can see that that's so. But the idea that there was a trade-off between free speech and inclusivity carried the day initially in our campus discourse. And I really think it could do so only by ignoring both American history and the empirical world beyond the Green Mountains, which provides inescapable evidence that it is precisely the marginalized who suffer the most when civil liberties are compromised. But the view that inclusivity and free speech are mutually exclusive had and will continue to have popular appeal. Why? Because it seems to embrace moderation. An average person can say, oh, there's these crazy free speech people and there's these crazy inclusivity people, and they both have a point, so I'm in the middle. It looks like you guys are having a bad divorce. I'm just going to keep my head down and do my work and not have anything to do with this debate. So I think this is true in many political contexts when there are kind of explosive issues, is that most people will refuse to take a side. And this is very much an issue where one had to take a side because it's a matter of principle, in my view. But many people don't want to choose a side. Have you watched the musical Hamilton? Are you familiar with the soundtrack to Hamilton? Cadets don't watch Hamilton? I won't use that analogy then, because it won't mean anything to you, but you should all go listen to the soundtrack to Hamilton. It's a great artistic accomplishment. I quoted from Hamilton in my congressional testimony. That's how strongly I feel about it. There were quite a few brave souls, however, who saw the foundation of the university under challenge and spoke up publicly. They understood that academic freedom is a foundation for both knowledge and human excellence, and that it matters what is happening in universities because democracy and liberal education are intertwined. Two of my colleagues organized the Principles of Free Expression petition. They garnered over 100 signatures from Middlebury faculty, and it was published in the Wall Street Journal in March. I can't tell you how much that meant to me because I had a serious brain injury. I was in a dark room, and someone read to me that column, and I wanted to cry that they had stood up and signed these principles. And if you look at who signed it, there were three general patterns among the signatories. First, many supporters had studied or experienced intellectual life under an authoritarian or totalitarian regime. So they knew how precious freedom of speech was. Second pattern among the signatories was that many had lived in American red states and had loved ones with whom they disagreed politically. So they're used to loving people with whom they have political disagreements. And finally, third pattern is quite a few, and this is the part that's disturbing. That's why I think it's really important to talk to all of you here about this. Most of them were older rather than younger. Now, I myself happen to fall into all three of these categories. I should also add that professors from the STEM fields, mathematics, technology, you know what STEM is, right? This is the military. Yeah. Professors from the STEM fields, philosophy, and religion were disproportionately represented on that list. So the key to upholding freedom of speech on college campuses, in my view, is to mobilize the STEM fields. Because we can talk about this more later if you like, they're in their laboratories, they don't want to be bothered, but they rely heavily on federal funds to do their research, and if anything's going to jeopardize their research, they will come out of their laboratories and vote on the faculty floor. So this is important to keep in mind. In general, the signatories understood the critical importance of being able to disagree for the sake of the community, for the sake of free inquiry, and for democracy itself. It was shocking to discover that I had colleagues who did not share my understanding of the Academy's and America's core values. So looking ahead to the future, we really didn't talk about this in Congress, but I think that's the next step. The main thing that came out of the hearing was that both parties support freedom of expression on college campuses, and all the panelists did not want to see some kind of legislation to uphold freedom of expression on college campuses. We thought that would be a mistake. We should let the universities take care of it. 3 lessons I would draw from this that might be interesting to you are the following. Institutions of higher learning, this would be the first lesson, cannot be in the business of policing symbolic violence. You know, this is the argument is made that Charles Murray is speaking and it's symbolic violence to certain marginalized groups. So I would argue that if campuses are going to police symbolic violence, they will wind up damaging the ideals of critical and free inquiry for which the university properly stands. Universities, in my view, exist to promote an arena in which ideas can be exchanged freely, not to render value judgments on the ideals themselves. There are larger implications to getting this right. I think reducing groupthink, which is what a kind of mob response to a speaker is, reducing groupthink in the academy is a prerequisite for reducing groupthink in the electorate. So what we're doing on college campuses is directly connected to what's going on in the country, making this an extraordinarily important issue. Second, this is an underappreciated aspect of what happened at Middlebury. It's the part that really gets me angry, all right? The AEI Club, the students invited Charles Murray to campus. I agreed to moderate that event. Incidentally, I also agreed to moderate an event 2 weeks later with Edward Snowden. Another group of students invited me to do that, so I'm kind of an equal opportunity interlocutor. I will take on and talk to, engage with the speaker from both sides of the political spectrum. But what happened then was that the political science department, because we're mostly all Democrats, we're always looking for great Republican perspectives. Why? Because we don't want to be indoctrinating our students. We want to have them engage political issues and understand all the different potential perspectives there might be. So the political science department agrees to co-sponsor this event, and then something amazing happens. It violates all past norms of conduct at the university. Another department, sociology, anthropology, or at least its chair, because there were divisions within that department, decided to try to publicly censor the political science department. They were telling us, you have to withdraw your co-sponsorship. And they were rallying all these people to sign things to get us to withdraw our co-sponsorship. This is deeply ironic because 2 years prior, the sociology anthropology department and many other departments at Middlebury co-sponsored a talk and paid a lot of money for Angela Davis, who we now know was on the payroll of the Soviet Union for much of her activism career. None of us tried to stop that from happening. Some people might not go. My husband went and my husband is a refugee from communist Czechoslovakia, so he takes it personally. You know, that she was sort of excusing what was going on in East Germany while his family was suffering there. He went and asked a really tough question, but no one tried to shut it down. So this was really unacceptable, what they did. It violated norms of collegiality that have long been established, and leads me to believe that if universities support a Treaty of Westphalia, you studied the Treaty of Westphalia, right? If we uphold that on college campuses for departments, I just think we'll be in a much better space on these issues. Let each department decide what it's worth their students engaging. And I told Congress, let's be clear. I told Senator Warren this, actually. You could see it in the testimony. No faculty member is ever going to co-sponsor a talk by Richard Spencer. Charles Murray is not Richard Spencer. He's a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He writes these fat, big books that, if you really read them, they're not inflammatory, they're seriously written, and he is respected in Republican circles. So to equate the two of those as being provocateurs is just, to me, fundamentally misguided. Third thing I would point out, and then I'll conclude, is I think viewpoint diversity is very important in liberal education. I was a graduate student in the Harvard Government Department, and I had conservative professors like Harvey Mansfield, like James Q. Wilson, even like Sam Huntington. These professors really changed my life because even though we fundamentally disagreed, they forced me to re-examine my biases, and I began to understand more clearly why I believed what I did and why. So I think viewpoint diversity is an asset for any institution of higher learning. Part of the reason I invited Charles Murray, that is, or not invited him, I did not invite him. I agreed to moderate the talk with him. But part of the reason I participated is that I wanted my own students to have the same educational experience I did, to experience a whole diverse range of views. Well, let me conclude, so we have plenty of time for questions, with some wise words from the Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo, who won the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize while imprisoned for his commitment to democratic values and who died this summer. For his Nobel lecture, he penned the following memorable lines. "Freedom of expression is the foundation of human rights, the source of humanity, and the mother of truth. To strangle freedom of speech is to trample on human rights, stifle humanity, and suppress truth." There's a dangerous idea that has recently taken hold on the American left that one must fight fire with fire. As a result, we have an alt-left and an alt-right in the United States. In resisting what they see as extremism, the alt-left embraces extremist tactics. Democracy and reasoned debate have been and will be the main casualties since the extreme left, both the extreme left and the extreme right, are rebelling against tolerance itself. In this environment, upholding freedom of expression protects all of us because it gives us individual ways to dissent without resorting to violence. More broadly, our constitutional democracy will depend on whether Americans can relearn how to engage civilly with one another. And we can all play a role in this. We can all model the behavior we want to see as citizens, as senators, as professors, and move the country in a better direction. Our national security also depends on it. Because think about it. America's enemies all seek to divide us. I could take you through what, Al-Qaeda, ISIL, Vladimir Putin. They all seek to divide us, and we must not allow them to do so. I think I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention. I'd welcome your questions about anything whatsoever I've spoken about, and even things that I might not have spoken about. Thank you very much. Anything, don't be shy. You're cadets, come on. Show me what you got.
It's not working.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Cadet Lynch. I'm from Norwich University, Northfield, Vermont.
Oh, yeah. So you're from the...
So I figured I'd have to ask you a question.
Yeah. Yeah, I studied it. I studied Russian at Norwich.
Okay, they don't have that anymore.
Yeah. Because it was infiltrated by the KGB. Did you know that?
No, I did not know that.
Yeah, it was.
Should be working now? Okay, great.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you feel like the riots, not only at like Middlebury College, but other colleges and universities across the nation, do you feel like the root cause of that is just an institutional failure, like among these universities, especially like the way they teach the importance of the right to free speech, or is there like an underlying cause to all this?
That's a super good question, and a lot of this has to do with leadership, and a lot of this has to do with being willing not to be liked. To do what I did, I had to become like a witch-like figure in Vermont. I can't even tell you. People just didn't know what to make of me. You had some people on the extreme left on the faculty saying, I think she's really a Republican. She says she's a Democrat and she worked for Hillary, but she supported military recruiting on campus. She's really a Republican, and all these strange things about me. And it was hard, right? It was really hard. So I think that's a big part of it. I think for both students, faculty, and even administration, if you have someone who's emotionally distraught saying, I am going to be triggered if you bring Charles Murray to campus. This is my home. How can you be doing this to me in my home? It's a natural human response to say, oh my God, I feel your pain. I'm going to back you up. And that happened in the protest too. I talked to a number of my students who went to the protest not planning to shut down speech, and they wound up doing it because if you look at that video, people are just so upset. And they want to be good humans. They want to help them. But we all have to stop back and remember that emotions are important, but reason is more important at the university. And reason is more important for coming up with the right policies that are going to bring about the things you want to see. So that's, to me, the great tragedy about what happened, is they brought about the opposite of what they sought to achieve precisely because they let emotions overrun their reasoning processes. Yeah, so we all each have a role to play here. If we all speak the truth will prevail, right? But thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Good morning. Is this thing on?
That's great. There's so many questions. I'm excited.
Good morning, ma'am. Cadet Chernowski, VMI. So
All right.
I'm going to pose this question that I asked my very left-leaning girlfriend, who strongly says universities are not suppressing free speech. And my question to you is, I'd heard of your case, but not the details. So
Yep.
were there any punishments or punitive actions handed out to the students that pulled these fire alarms, caused this violence to occur? Because my thought process is you're saying that you are promoting free speech by and inviting the speaker, and that's all well and good. But if at the end of the day there's no punishment for these illegal acts, these harmful acts, I feel like the universities are passively suppressing free speech by not punishing these criminal acts.
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, Middlebury was criticized because no one was suspended. And I think everybody who was punished got a mark in the record that with good behavior went away, with the exception of one person. One or two possibly have a permanent mark in the record that they're required to disclose if asked. So some would say that's not a very severe punishment. But to me, what it comes down to is the rules were read to them, and there's no question they violated the rules. So as an institution, we had an obligation to discipline them. And I'm just afraid that maybe the wrong lessons were learned because that same group of faculty who supported the protests sought to shut down the disciplinary hearings.
So would you argue that's a passive suppression of free speech?
It does wind up being a passive suppression. I think it really does wind up being a passive suppression of free speech. And I think it amounts to educational malpractice in some sense because people don't take the right lessons away from it. You know, I'm a parent. You may one day be parents someday too, and the one thing you know about raising children is what? Your job is not to be liked, right? Sometimes you have to not be liked to teach them the right things, and I think we just have to have some college administrators may have to take that lesson to heart. But that's seen as like kind of oppressive to some members of the faculty. This idea that there might be someone who knows better than the students. That's a foreign concept to members of any military academy, the idea that there's no hierarchy. I mean, you're not going to tell your superiors how to think, are you? There's a real idea on some liberal arts college campuses that the students know better, we should listen to them. So that's the kind of milieu in which these decisions have to be taken. In that milieu, I did not testify in those hearings.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's go to the other side.
Yes.
Chris Henson, Texas A&M University. So you mentioned Richard Spencer, so I wanted to ask your opinion. So last year we had Richard Spencer on our campus. It was a bit of a situation. There was protests on both sides. It was on the day of a TAPS for a student who had passed away. So this coming year he tried to, so the university allowed him to come that time. But this coming year, he was going to come on the day of 9/11 So the university passed down that they, if he was not invited by a student organization, that they weren't going to allow him to come on campus.
Right.
Just wanted to hear your opinion in terms of how that fits into the free speech stuff you're talking about.
You tell me something. So he came to speak. Was it at the invitation of a student at the end, or did he just come and rent the space?
No. So last year he came just of his own volition. But I mean, there was support on both sides, protest and counter protest there.
Yeah, you put your finger on something really important, and this is something to take away. There's a public-private distinction here that needs to be made. At any private institution, if a student organization doesn't sponsor you, you don't get to speak. But at a public institution, I think they open their facilities to the general public, and so you can't refuse someone who wants to speak there. That means that Richard Spencer can come and speak at your institution without any kind of institutional sponsorship. And to me, this is just really easy. If you want to decide as a student what's worth listening to, if no student organization and no faculty member is sponsoring the talk, you probably don't need to go. You may as well just ignore that, because that's basically saying there's no intellectual content to this that someone is going to defend. And that's why, to me, what happened in Middlebury is so different, because Charles Murray is not Richard Spencer and not Milo. He's not, well, let's just leave it at that, if there's a difference. Did I answer your question?
I was kind of wondering, so in terms of, do you think that that's the line that can be, so the university decided he was going to try to, even though, again, this year on 9/11, he was going to try to come, uninvited and not even having a facility use, was going to, planning to apparently march through the streets, that type of thing. Do you think that that's the point where we can cut off and say, that's a boundary where we can say this person shouldn't be coming? Or where do you draw that line? Because there's a fear of a slippery slope there.
Yeah, I do have a fear of a slippery slope, and so I'm pretty much a free speech absolutist, because when you think about how you're going to put together the committee that decides who gets to speak, it immediately gets very complicated. But there might be a simple solution, and you would know, your lawyers would know whether this is legal. Why can't you just say you can't do an event on campus without sponsorship by a member of the community? I don't see why that would be illegal. I understand it's been otherwise, but maybe that could be changed. That would be my response.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Ma'am.
Hello, ma'am. Cadet Gula from VMI. I have a quick question, kind of building off the cadet before me. Was there any backup or support from your university after this incident? Did they issue a statement? Did they give you any support after you were essentially assaulted by these students? Or was it just, as you mentioned earlier, they just kind of let it kind of drift off? Did you?
The president came to the hospital that evening with me, issued a statement apologizing both to Charles Murray and to me. But from that point on, I felt pretty invisible. And the reason that I was invisible is because if you're going to support shutting down speech, you don't want to acknowledge that what happened to me is connected to what happened inside the hall. You want to say, oh, those were outside forces, and there were outside forces. Students invited Antifa to campus. They were not inside the hall because you had to have an ID to see the speech. But people do want to separate that out and say, yeah, that happened outside, we condemn that, but what happened inside the hall is fine. And to me, that's a specious argument, because the two are directly connected. Because anytime you shut down speech, it's an invitation to violence. That's why we have these heated and contested discussions. It's a way of resolving disputes and disagreements without pulling out guns or swords or having a duel. So I think, I wish they would have acknowledged publicly my injury, precisely to underscore the point that shutting down speech is never a good idea.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yes.
Доброе утро. I'm Cadet Ingram from Norwich University.
All right.
Uh,
Green Mountains.
yeah.
Green Mountain Boys.
I've seen a lot of divide within my campus between professors and students, and it has come to the point in some classrooms that professors will shy away from political questions.
Yeah.
And even students themselves will like not talk to that professor. I was wondering if you have any like steps on trying to take the hostility out of our campus, because I have seen it grow within the last couple of years. And how you can just listen to them, like even if you don't agree, they still have a voice, because a lot of that is like shut down just through the demeanor of the college.
It's a really good point, and she's dealing with a problem in Vermont that many of you probably don't deal with, which is Vermont, it could be Europe rather than the United States. It's a bunch of social democrats. We elect Bernie Sanders. So that's going to make your situation unique, I think, in some ways, different from other people's. But what can you do? Well, on any college campus, there are going to be professors who think like I do, so take their classes if you can. That's the thing that was so startling to me about what happened, is I don't experience captive minds in my classroom. If you've read Czeslaw Milosz's great book, The Captive Mind, about the experience under communism, that's a great book. It should be on your syllabus somewhere. Captive minds are minds that just simply aren't open to reason and persuasion. They know what they know, they think what they think, and nothing can change that. But in my classroom, students know they're free to speak their minds, and they're also free to make mistakes. And if someone offends someone, which rarely happens, I think once it's happened in my entire career, then I just say apologize so we can move on. And let ideas collide. And I think it's really possible to generate that kind of environment in the classroom. And there are many other professors on my campus who have similar classroom experiences, but I also know there are faculty my students tell me that don't do this, where they think you need to know, you've got to toe a particular party line if you're going to get a good grade. I'd avoid classes like that, because you're being educated to learn to think for yourself. And you can't think for yourself if someone's telling you what to think.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Ma'am.
Good morning. My name is
morning.
Caitlin Kellermeyer from Texas A&M University.
Welcome.
My question touches on actually the way that you answered the first question. Made me think. You talked about how when dealing with emotionally charged situations, when dealing with situations, especially on college campuses where freedom of expression is controversial, it's important to listen to reason as opposed to your emotions in order to promote that environment of free speech. It got me thinking about one of our speakers yesterday who talked about, and whose goal was to kind of reduce polarization and facilitate people's ability to have productive discussions by bringing people who are polarized together and having them relate to one another, because his argument was that the way that you facilitate that open discussion is by building trust and by showing people that underneath their reason and their facts on the emotional level, if they can relate as people and see that they have more in common than they have different, that will, I guess, facilitate that open expression, that open discussion, and make people more open to freedom of expression. And I was wondering just kind of what your thoughts are on that dichotomy between recognizing that in emotionally charged situations you have to step back and remember that freedom of expression is important to our humanity, versus also addressing and validating the emotions of the people who are in those situations in order to connect and have that productive, meaningful dialogue.
Yeah. That's a really great question. You articulated it really well. I think it just comes down to being empathetic. If someone is in emotional distress, you should listen to them, validate the emotion, and then say, okay, how can we improve this thing you're seeing? And that's going to be a different sort of discussion than the emotions that come out of responding to some injustice. And the problem I see is that some faculty members think that the expression of those emotions is the end of education, and I would disagree with them. I don't think it's the end of education, it's the beginning. We want to harness our emotions in productive ways to both help us grow as human beings, but also to make the world a better place. Because trust me, when emotions drive politics, nothing good ever comes from it. If you have an example of an instance where there were emotions driving politics that produced something positive, just sheer emotions and not reason. There's plenty of emotions in the American founding, right? But they're channeling that into reasoning about what the best form of government might be. I think they provide a great example for us all. But thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Good morning, man.
Good morning.
Cadet Wilburn, VMI.
All right.
I was wondering kind of what you meant by educational malpractice that you mentioned earlier, because I'm not really sure if you think there's a specific level where this breakdown in education occurs.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of people from very diverse backgrounds here at VMI. I'm sure the other military schools are very similar. And the idea of shutting down a speech because we don't like what the person is saying, to me at least, I'm sure to the other cadets here, seems ludicrous and childish.
Yes.
I'm wondering, do you think that that's, I personally think that's kind of because of the environment VMI creates and the other military schools, where
Absolutely.
you learn very early on that basically the world doesn't revolve around you, that your opinion isn't the only one that matters, and that you have to work with other people to accomplish your goals. I was wondering if you think there is a specific level where this breakdown education occurs, and how we could bring kind of those lessons to non-military campuses.
That's an excellent question and very well articulated, and I'm glad to hear this wouldn't happen at VMI. I sort of had a sense that was the case, but it's good to hear it. Look, to me it's really simple. No one has apologized to me for being injured, for injuring me, contributing to injuring me. So I don't need to punish someone. I don't need to suspend someone. I'd be really happy if I just got a public apology. Why? Because that's part of the educational experience, right? If you make a mistake and you're going to learn from it, you need to own it. And I don't think the students have owned it. So that's what I'd like to see happen, and I think that could be a really positive, because the thing that concerns me most is not my injury, but my students. I want them to, it was a horrible experience, and I want them to learn the right things from it. Otherwise, it's wasted. So hopefully that's in process now, and hopefully we'll get to a place where everybody learns something that can
So would you think
help
that,
to improve our world.
would you think that just teaching people to be accountable for their actions would,
Absolutely.
is kind of something that needs to
Yeah.
happen?
Well, I have this argument with my husband. Maybe you have arguments with your girlfriend about this. When I say I just want an apology, he's like, what do you mean? They should all be punished. You know, they have to be held accountable. But I don't know. I think acknowledging you've done something wrong is holding someone accountable. You know,
Yes,
we can
ma'am.
have differences of opinion on that, but it is a form of accountability as well. So that would be my response. And I think it allows you to move on more when things are really divisive. It's sort of like the concept behind the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. If you followed those in South Africa and other places, own up to it, and then you can move on.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Wait, where did my young woman go? There was a woman who was going to ask a question.
You must have answered
She
it.
decided not to. She's what? Oh, okay. Okay, good. I was hoping she wouldn't decide not to ask a question. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Cadet Thomas from VMI. In all these sort of interventions and shutting things down, there's sort of the fundamental notion on the part of the protesters that this speech constitutes violence, namely violence against minorities and marginalized communities.
Yep.
How do you sort of reason and open dialogue with people that believe that just by doing this you are committing violence against them? How do you try to disarm that?
Well, there are some people you can't reason with. You can't reason with the Spanish Inquisition. You know, it's not going to get you anywhere. So you want to pick the people you try to reason with. But yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, they're not. They think there's a group of people who think reason is itself a tool of white supremacy. So then you can't really have an argument. But what I would point out to them, and I think this has made an impact, is people will say, well, Charles Murray, he's fine, but his ideas have been weaponized. They're used to harm people of color. I would say fair enough, they have been weaponized, but Kimberly Crenshaw, who's the author of Intersectionality, Pierre Bourdieu, Jean-Francois Lyotard, the French post-structuralist, those ideas have been weaponized as well, and we're not shutting them down. So you have to ask the question, on what grounds are you shutting certain speakers down? And you have to come to the conclusion it's just ideology. And that has no place in an institution of higher learning. So you can try that approach.
Thank you very
Ideas
much.
of the web, look, who were the first social justice warriors, ladies and gentlemen? Who were the first social justice warriors? that affected the world? The Bolsheviks. They were social justice warriors. Seriously. Think about it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Ma'am, Cadet Duff,
Yeah.
Virginia Military Institute. Why do you think organizations such as the Southern Poverty Law are so effective in employing tactics such as groupthink? And do you think that organizations such as this should be allowed to exist?
Yes, they definitely should be allowed to exist. I'd like to see them modify their practices, and I did have the opportunity to say that directly to Richard Cohen, the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center, who testified with me. I had to sit next to him. That, you know, there's some clear proponents of hate, but there are people on that list that do not belong there, and their lives have become living hells. So I told him, you need to take that down. He took my card and said, we'll talk. So maybe they'll be moving in the right direction. Why do they do it? They're doing it to raise money. Why? We've made progress. You know, they got rid of the Ku Klux Klan pretty much. So now if they want to raise money, they've got to find new enemies. And I think they've crossed some lines that shouldn't be crossed in so doing. But people seem to be realizing that, so hopefully we'll see things move in a positive direction.
Thank you, ma'am.
Last question.
Yes, ma'am. One more question. It seems ironic to me that with all the emphasis on anti-bullying in schools and domestic violence and things like that on campus, I mean, it's rampant. Do you think there's a possibility that that correlation could occur, that this is actually bullying and a big scale when you shut somebody down and you assault and so on and so forth? So is there a possibility that with all this education that's going on in K through 12, that could have an impact on the future?
Yeah, K through 12 education we have a civic education crisis in our country. And this was a topic of discussion in the Senate as well. And that is part of the problem. I mean, some of my students really don't understand the precious gift they've been given as Americans with our Constitution and how it compares to all these other regimes around the world. In other words, do you think the United States is a bad place? And there's a lot of things wrong with it. I would challenge them to show me a place that's better. But they're not thinking that way. They're not educated. So they have to be educated to come to the realization of the precious inheritance that they do have.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's please give Dr. Stanger. Dr. Stanger, first, thank you for sharing your personal story with us and for some great insights about free expression and the proper role in academia, and you've set us up well for our next exercise.
Excellent. Glad to hear it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much for your attention.